Winchcombe again. When I left here 2 weeks ago, I thought, when am I going to see it all again? Here I am. Turns out that this area still has some things which you absolutely have to look at. Let's go. Heading south, essentially on the Cotswold Way, it appears that the public footpath is going through Corndean Hall, or, well, the grounds of Corndean Hall, of course. We are heading towards Bella Snap, a long barrow built by people in the Younger Stone Age, what we call the Neolithic period, and today managed by English Heritage. This is the story of a gravesite that was constructed with unbelievable skill and dedication 4,000 years before the Roman period, and was ripped apart and smashed to bits with equally unbelievable lack of skill and dedication during the lifetime of my own great-grandmother. But, and it is typical for prehistoric sites in this part of the world, we will also find hints about incredible things that might still wait to be discovered just a few meters away from us. Bella Snap. That sounds like an odd name. But perhaps if you live in a place called Winchcombe or Burton on the Water or Stow in the Wold or Upper Oddington, I'm not making these up, you might say, what's so strange about Bella Snap? What is accepted today as the most probable origin is an Old Saxon word for Beacon Hill. When exactly the Neolithic people arrived here, we don't know very well. Until a bit more than 10,000 years ago, this was very close to the border of the Devengian ice sheet, which covered more than half of Britain. So whilst at the end of the Mesolithic period this here wasn't exactly a glacier, the going would have been pretty rough for people who had yet to invent central heating. What we do know is that some 6,000 years ago, farming the by then fertile land in the valleys of the English Cotswolds and keeping livestock, they had put themselves into a rather comfortable position. That, of course, is a matter of perspective. You and me today would certainly not envy them. What I mean is that they no longer had to spend every hour, every day frantically hunting and gathering for survival. They had become settled. And I sympathise. I became settled here shortly after I first laid my eyes on the Cotswolds. These people started to have some time on their hands, and they spent a large amount of it looking after their dead. Rather sweet, I always think. That is the period from which we see the earliest surviving elaborate burial sites. This must be the main entrance then. Well, wrong. There's nothing behind this. It's fake. At least as far as we can tell from the first archaeological excavations. Before we come to the horror show part of this story in a bit, for now let's recap what we know about this place through the work done so far. Our prehistoric ancestors had constructed several, probably more or less spherical mounds on this site, containing chambers made of upright sarcens supporting huge sandstone slabs of up to 2.5 by 2.5 meters large and more than half a meter thick. One of them would have weighed up to 10 tons. They then sealed all the gaps and covered the structure with rubble and soil. And they did that so well that even after 6,000 years the chambers therein were dry and had no ingress of soil. Very much the way they had left them when they were first sealed up. Inside, the skeletons of their relatives were sitting upright against the chamber walls, hunched and with their knees against their chests.
At some later stage, or let's say final stage, these separate burial mounds were connected into the long shape we see here today, surrounded by a very neatly made dry stone wall, and the falls portal was built at the northern end. It all worked. The skeletons from that distant age have been sitting there undisturbed for century after century. Outside in the world the pyramids of Giza were built, Stonehenge was built some 1,000 years later. The Romans came and went, the Anglo-Saxons lived here in the Dark Ages, their kingdoms slowly morphing into the England we know today.
And then came Lauriston Winterbotham. In 1864 he led an excavation that quickly went completely out of hand. They started at the obvious place, the falls entrance, and in order to get behind the entrance portal they carefully smashed the top lintel to pieces with pickaxes. Then they looked behind it and found nothing. Subsequently they followed the stone wall around the circumference of the long barrow because they were thinking that maybe that way they find a passage leading to the centre. And they were successful.
Thus the east and west burial chambers were found. Out came the pickaxes, and the massive roof slabs, some 6 square metre surface and half a metre thickness, were pulverised, their bits falling into the chambers below, smashing the skeletons to hash. Mr. Chamberlain, the owner of the land, had massive stones dragged away using chains and horses to gain quick access to whatever treasures might be found underneath. Somehow Mr. Winterbotham, the leading antiquarian, managed to be always absent when the worst acts of carnage were committed. He arrived in time to have missed the removal of what artefacts later ended in private collections, and at least managed to salvage a few skulls and bone fragments which are now, thankfully, in museums in Cheltenham and Winchcombe. In 1893 it was our old acquaintance Mrs. Emma Dent who stepped in and saved what she could. I quote from her diary. "They are putting Bella's Knap in order again. 30 years ago it was opened by the archaeologists, and when everything was taken away the stones were left all about. A disgrace. I am now renting it from the Cravens to, in some slight way, restore it." And that she did. At her own expense, she had the 2 main burial chambers restored to at least something close to their original geometry, the mound put back on top, and the stones of the Neolithic revetment reused to build what we now see here as a little wall around the whole site. Bella's Knap was professionally visited once more. From 1928 to 1930, Sir James Barry and other distinguished archaeologists salvaged what they could and puzzled together a lot of information from the wreckage. Thanks to them, we know what we do today about the findings, deductions and conclusions. But they also did one more thing. They located and interviewed some surviving local witnesses of the 19th century excavations. Among them was Fred Simmons, back in the 1880s a young lad working on the Sudeley Castle estate for Mr. and Mrs. Dent. When the first hole had been hacked through the roof slabs, Fred Simmons was thin enough to be lowered down into the, until then, undisturbed chamber. It is his eyewitness report from which we know how the skeletons of Bella's Knap were leaning against the walls of their chamber. And they recorded 2 other, even more intriguing personal recollections. William Aston and Albert Potter, both of Winchcombe, recalled finding more skeletons and chambers in the 1880s and 1890s that never played a role in subsequent excavations. In fact, Mr. Potter had come across a large horizontal stone supported on uprights, covering a chamber with a single skeleton, sitting in a corner with its elbows on its knees. On orders of Emma Dent, whose protective instincts had kicked in by then, in some ways she was well ahead of her time, he closed the chamber and covered the capstone with rubble.
And here we are, standing on top of some 1,500 cubic meters of soil and stone and nothing else. Do we really think The Stone Age people have put this massive portal 20 metres away of the only existing burial chambers to fill it with nothing. With the anecdotal and let's call it the geometrical evidence we have looked at so far, there's just this chance that Belas Knap still has some spectacular surprises up its sleeve. Isn't it time we had another look? A proper, professionally done, modern archaeological excavation, using all the tools at our disposal, minimal invasive, or let's say at least non-destructive. Surely we can do better than those Victorian butchers. I have a feeling there are still some spectacular secrets Belas Knap can reveal.